Hi, I'm Ajit Lenin. Welcome to the Enterprise Architecture video series part 18. We've been looking at the six-layer framework that I introduced to establish enterprise architecture practices. And last few weeks, we've been spending time on the architecture domains layer. And last week, we looked at the application architecture. Like this week, we'll take a look at the technology architecture, and that would close the architecture domains layer as such. So let's go get into the technology architecture and look at what are the components of the technology architecture. So just like the application architecture, I'm splitting the technology architecture components also broadly into two categories. There are macro components and the micro components, right? The macro components are technology landscape, which basically gives a broad definition about what technology choices do we have, what technologies to use within the enterprise. And deployment landscape pretty much defines what is the inventory we got for deployment, right? What resources we got, what data centers or cloud platforms we have got out at our disposal for deploying the applications. On the micro level, we have the application technology architecture, which basically defines the technology architecture at the application level for each application. And the application deployment architecture defines how these applications to be deployed, right? Let's start with the technology landscape, right? So technology landscape, as I explained, it's basically a catalog of technology choices that is recommended or approved for the developer delivery teams or developers to use, right? They can choose from. It's a catalog from where they can choose from. It basically also gives a matrix mapping the non-functional building blocks, right? Because the technology components on what are the technology choices we have, right? There could be one non-functional building blocks could be mapped to one or more choices and will give the application teams a choice to choose from. And using those technology choices, right, we need to build something, what I'm defining as technology stacks, right? So based on we looked at the application reference models defined on the application architecture side, right? Using those reference models, we can define a ideal technology stack for that reference models, right? So this helps in for the delivery teams in choosing the right technology, right? So an application that is following a particular reference model can choose this technology stack, right? I mean, there could be one or more technology stacks choices. They can pick one of those technology stacks. So it basically defines for each of these non-functional building blocks as well as the functional building blocks, what are the technology choices, combinations that we can use, right? It also includes a mapping of then once we have this technology stack for the reference models, then we can get to a matrix of applications mapped to the respective technology stack, right? So the delivery teams can actually come and pick which one they want to go with, right? So which will actually define the technology stack for the application, which also defines for each functional and non-functional building blocks of the application, what technology to be used. And technology landscape has to be date bound, right, and versioned. So because as technologies evolve, it cannot remain static, right? So it always should have a expiry date, and then it has to be revisited revisited in a periodic manner and make new choices. We can add new technology choices to some of the technology become obsolete, so they can be taken out, etc. Right. So, and also once we define that, once it's a technology stack goes to a new version, then we need to have a roadmap for each application to define that how the application is planning to move to the next version of the technology stack, right? So this is on a overall what a technology landscape should contain. So based on that, let's look at what is the meta model for the technology landscape, right? So now, as I said, so we have non-functional building blocks and functional building blocks, which comes from the application mapping. But both the non-functional building blocks and functional building blocks can have a number of technology choices, right? Usually maybe 2 or 3 technology for each building blocks. And application reference models can use any of the technology stacks we define, which is technology stacks is just an aggregation of technology choices. And application based on the technology, the technology stacks that an application reference model can use, a particular application can use one technology stack, pick one technology stack out of it, right? And both the technology choice as well as the technology stack, both are versioned. As I said, it always has to be dated, right? So take a version which would have what can document what version of the technology we are using, what is the expiry date we want to put on so that we know when to revisit that. And once we revisit that, when are we going to deprecate that technology choice or the stack, and when it would be out, when it would be out of support. So based on that, the applications can plan for their migration or technology updates, right? And then that would go into the roadmap, right? So this is a very high level. What is the meta model for a technology landscape? Now let's look at the deployment landscape, right? So as I said earlier, deployment landscape basically is an inventory of what we have at our disposal to deploy our applications or the IT stack, right? So it's a catalog of different compute locations available for us, right? And with along with the limitations. So each location, is there any limitations to its own compute as well as storage, etc., right? So the locations can be either, it could be a public cloud like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud Platform, or it could be a private cloud, which is, or a private or a dedicated cloud, or it could be, nowadays we have cloud edge technologies coming in. So the infrastructure like AWS Outpost, which is an edge compute infrastructure. So all those things would come into as a private cloud, right? And it could be also a SaaS. So if you're going with something like a Salesforce or a ServiceNow or Adobe Cloud, so those are SaaS platforms where we are going to use the providers, service providers, cloud compute, right? Or it could be a data center which is on-prem for the or which enterprise owns or manages, right? And for each location, it is important that we capture any security restrictions or policies or regulations, right? Especially in enterprises that are global. So each compute location should have their own, there may be limitations, policies or regulations that kind of governs that a region or a country, right? So that also has to be documented as part of this. So this overall gives us a landscape of what do we have at our disposal to deploy our applications, right? So now we will see how do we apply this when we go into the micro level, right? Let's look at application technology architecture first. So application technology architecture is basically basically overlays the technology stack we choose with the previous exercise when we do the technology landscape. So for an application, we take an application and its component architecture, which we defined in the application architecture side of it, take the technology stack, overlay it, that gives us the application technology architecture. The additional thing that we would need to add would be define the operational KPIs, right? How we want to define the KPIs for an operational KPIs of the applications, like how do you want to, is it a mission critical application? What would be the SLA, etc.? All can be documented as part of this exercise. And also the one additional aspect I want to point out, we talked about when we talked in the application architecture. Once we have the application technology architecture done, we can, when the next iteration, when we get into the application architecture, we can actually use that to move from a logical data model to the physical data model. So it's a pretty straightforward exercise. I would believe it's just an overlaying exercise of taking the application component architecture, taking the technology stack we have chosen for the application, and putting up together an application technology architecture. Now let's see how do we take this and build an application deployment architecture, right? So application deployment architecture is basically a convergence of the other three components which we defined, right? So application technology architecture, the deployment models we have, deployment models will come to that deployment models next. I'll explain what it is, right? So we have application technology architecture, deployment models, and deployment landscape, right? We can put them together. We know how and where we're going to deploy the application, right? So that's application deployment architecture. It is basically a convergence of these three, right? For each component, it basically the application deployment architecture defines the location at which these components are to be deployed and how they are going to be deployed, right? Applying the deployment model. So deployment model is basically a similar reference model for deployment. It basically gives us the how we want to deploy based on the operational KPIs, how we want to deploy for a particular component or a non-functional building block or a functional building block, what are the deployment ways we can deploy it, right? So based on the operational KPI, we can choose one deployment model for that application, right? Application deployment architecture basically provides that last mile details on how the application needs to be deployed and operationalized, right? So let's look at with few examples what I mean by deployment model, right? So let's go into deployment model. So deployment models are defined for each technology of choice, right? If I want to say logging, right, or a load balancing or a web service, right? Each of these components, based on the technology we have chosen for it, and based on the operational requirement of the application, right? Basically, when I say operational requirement of the application, it is like availability, redundancy, or scalability, right? What is the requirement for our availability? Is it a mission critical application? Is it business critical, or is it non-critical, or can we implement redundancy, data redundancy, or what are the scalability rules, right? So all these are the part of the operational KPIs, which can be applied based on the technology choice. And then we say that if this is a technology we have chosen and it is a mission critical type of application, let's use this deployment model, right? For example, an application could be mission critical, as explained. So I need to support high availability, right? That would mean we need an active kind of a deployment where we need to have a full redundancy somewhere else, so that if this data center goes down, the other data center becomes automatically switches over to the other data center, and there is no downtime for the application, right? Similarly, a particular another example could be a set of services can be see a burst of volume, right? So maybe the morning time, the volume could be high, right? And then the volume goes down. And then maybe the evening time it again goes up, right? So there is a burst of volume coming in. That means the application has to be or the services, set of services has to dynamically scale, right? So that probably we need some kind of a container orchestration to dynamically scale the application. Right. So another example could be an application sometimes could be highly available, but the data it uses could be so huge that we cannot do a full replication to have an active configuration, right? So that means application probably have to be segmented out, right? And segmented out, and then we can have an active for each segments, right? So there could be n number of combinations. It's again all based on operation, how the organization wants to do it, but defining a deployment model for each technology choice based on what type of operational requirements we have helps us in picking the right deployment model for the applications, and then apply it on the application deployment architecture. So which gives us a full-fledged last mile detail on how and where we want to deploy the application, how we want to operationalize it, right? To summarize, this week we looked at the components of the technology architecture. We looked at technology landscape, deployment landscape, application technology architecture, application deployment architecture, and a little bit on the deployment models, right? That concludes the technology architecture part of it, as well as the entire architecture domain layer. We have been spending a lot of time on the architecture domain layer. Now next week we'll look at the artifacts layer, right? Thank you.